Hi kids. Today you're going to learn all about the very first location that you need to put on your Colorado history timeline. This very first location is called Mesa Verde. Mesa Verde is now a national park that is located in the southwest corner of the state of Colorado. This location became a national park in 1906, over 100 years ago. What is Mesa Verde? On December 18, 1888, two cowboys, Richard Wetherill and Charlie Mason from the Mancos area, were out looking for stray cattle, but instead they found an ancient cliff dwelling. It was snowy and they could see the outline of a magnificent city. And that was when Mesa Verde was rediscovered after it had been abandoned hundreds of years before. It took another 21 years after the cowboys rediscovered the ancient city for a man named Jesse Walter Fikes from the Smithsonian Institute to come and excavate the site. Excavate means to remove earth carefully to find buried remains. What have they found out about Mesa Verde, you ask? So they have found that Mesa Verde were home to the Ancesteral Puebloan people. They made it their home for over 700 years. The time frame that they lived there was from 600 to 1300. That was over 800 years ago. Today, the park protects nearly 5,000 known archaeological sites, including 600 different cliff dwellings. So on your on your timeline today, you are going to draw a picture of Mesa Verde, write at least 3 facts about the location, and you're going to put the date 600-1300 because that is the span of time that people lived in Mesa Verde in Colorado. Since it was over 800 years ago, what we're going to do now is you're actually going to see some videos from the from the National Park Association where you can actually see the park rangers talking to you about the different locations. So the first place that we're going to watch a video about is called Cliff Palace. Cliff Palace is the biggest of the cliff dwellings that you can see in Mesa Verde.
Cliff Palace is the largest cliff dwelling in North America.
It has 150 rooms. It has, well, we quote 21 kivas, but there are also 2 kiva-like rooms.
You can actually look at it from an overlook and see into almost every room.
When we get to Cliff Palace and you're waiting for the tour, you are at the overlook for it, so people can be looking down at it before the tour even.
I'm going to pause a couple of times throughout these videos to just explain a few things. On the videos or on the pictures that you can see of the actual cliff dwellings, even the one that's behind me, this is the same picture. They're both of Cliff Palace. You can see these black streaks along the sandstone. That is actually what they feel is, if you look, it's right above where they actually had fires at. And this is like the soot that came up, like almost like on a fireplace where you'll see the remnants of having a fire. That's actually what that is from hundreds of years ago.
Starts, which is not true at Balcony House or Longhouse. It looks like a whole city. Looks like a city much more than a palace, and it was a city rather than a palace.
In my opinion, it's the best archaeological site we have on the continent. After gathering the group at the platform, we begin down the trail. The trail was cut in the 20s and 30s, and it's cut right into the sandstone. And you go down some beautiful steps and then up a 10-foot tall ladder, and then you're in the site. And we gather the group in a small alcove, and we sit. For 15 minutes, we just look at the site, and we marvel together, and we take questions about the site. It's a great launching point to not only talk about what Cliff Palace was like 800 years ago, but the whole Four Corners region. It's a good launching point to talk about what the entire continent looked like 800 years ago. And from that point, we then walk with visitors directly underneath the architecture. When I first started giving tours of the site, I didn't really fully appreciate that middle stop because you're standing directly under the architecture. So really all you're seeing are these giant walls. But now I realize that is probably one of the most impressive parts of the whole site. Because when you're standing across canyon looking at Cliff Palace, or even from the overlook looking down, you don't quite understand how large the walls are. But when you're underneath, those walls are so large, you can't even see the entire site. And you get to look at each individually crafted block of sandstone that was crafted 800 years ago.
So you can actually look and see how they actually built the walls just out of small rocks and that they've made into rectangular prisms, and they've actually made just a wall, similar how we would make a brick wall even today. So these are actually windows or like ways to get into different rooms And so most likely before, in the 800 years ago, they probably had something covering it, or whether it was a little door, whether it was, they had roofs that would cover the rooms and everything else. So some of the stuff has went away, but this is in pretty good condition for 800 years later.
And to realize how much time and energy the Pueblo Society invested in these sites. They built these sites so grand that they were drawing people in from all over 800 years ago, and those walls are still drawing people in from even further places 800 years later. From there, we continue on up the steps, and we actually enter the site at that point. We actually get to walk up and around several kivas and look into a room with original plasters.
The kiva structure, a lot of people kind of mystified by it when they come into the park, because to a lot of people, if you don't know what it is, it just looks like a big open recess, basically a very circular underground room. But it was actually really advanced architecture. There used to be a roof that you could completely walk over. I was explaining to people that, this is church, and when you were a Pueblo person moving into your village, you're going to build your kiva first, and you're going to make sure your family's comfortable in there. That's kind of the most important spot, is just your religious area.
From that location, standing around the kivas, you can look back on the site that you just walked through, and you really get a sense of how grand it is and how beautiful it is. And the fact that it has 21 kivas, it really means it's something special. It's a place where people were gathering, not just living, but gathering as a whole community. I really believe it must have been central to life on the Mesa Verde. Not only is the site really grand, but again, the way you exit is the original entrance and exit. When you climb the ladders and you look just to your side, you can see the original hand and toe holds.
So if you could imagine climbing in and out of this cliff to get to your house, this is how you would do it. So they made like indentations in the rock that they could use as a ladder.
They used to get into the site. So 800 years later, not only are people gathering in these same places people were gathering long ago, but they're using the exact same routes.
The architecture at Cliff Palace, the 4-story buildings, the towers, remind us of the legacy that the ancestral Puebloan people left behind and how amazing they were when they were living here as well.
So just think about how tough it is even to draw a 4-story house nowadays. These people did it down inside of a cliff. Pretty amazing. So now we're going to look at Balcony House, which was a smaller dwelling that you can actually go tour. And this place, they think probably 2 families lived there just because of the size of it.
Balcony House is the Indiana Jones tour. This is the tour with the giant ladders and a tunnel you're going to have to squeeze through. But in between the ladder and the tunnel, there is a beautiful village that has been left behind by the ancestral Puebloan people. Balcony House seems to be like just a smaller village, not a big community center. So it has 38 rooms and 2 kivas. So they were kind of small little family unit, maybe 2 families living next to each other. Whereas the other places we give tours are like big city centers.
First off, just to get into the site, you have to climb a 32-foot tall ladder. Then you start to realize how fragile it really is. And so you have to be careful not to place your hands on the original structures themselves, like the balcony that Balcony House gets its name for. There's quite a few tight spaces that we get to squeeze our way through, and that's a lot of fun because we get to go into the dwellings itself.
So I'm going to pause this here and talk about, so he was talking about how not to touch things. What happens over time when people come and visit this place, they leave oils from their skin when you touch stuff. So what that actually does is it wears away the different stuff, and it makes the archaeological site not as sustainable as it has been for untouched. So if you look at this right here, you can actually see the bottom of this picture, or of this, where I pause the video, you can see that the stone looks all pretty clean and like natural. Where if you look up more towards the top of like the top of the ladder, that's actually where most people's arm lengths are, or like the arm height, because people have touched the wall right there and the oils from their skin have gotten onto the wall. And so that's why they ask you while you're there to try to do your best to not touch anything, because you do actually leave not necessarily a footprint, but definitely a handprint from your oils of your skin even when you touch stuff.
And also, Balcony House, it's right on the edge of the cliff, and so a lot of people are fearful of heights. But if you were to overcome your fear and you were to take the tour, you will be rewarded with some of the most amazing views from any cliff dwelling.
I think it's also kind of fun to come to Balcony House from below it, because your first view of it is looking up. And so you can see this big wall along the front of it, which is actually the retaining wall that the Pueblo people built to create this flat foundation to build on. When you get up there and you're standing on this level floor, I think you have more of a sense of all the work that went into building the place.
From there, you climb up a series of steps that are originally carved by the ancestral Puebloans, and you cross into the next plaza, which we call the Kiva Plaza, because there are two large kivas that are submerged down into the ground. One thing I really like about Balcony House, it provides better insight to what a home would have looked like 800 years ago here in Mesa Verde. And that's something you really don't get at Longhouse or Cliff Palace because they're just so large. But when you're inside Balcony House, it's a comfortable space. And I think a lot of visitors, they come to this park and they first see the cliff dwellings and they think that's an impossible place to live. But as soon as you climb that ladder and you're inside the North Plaza, it all makes sense. And people are no longer asking, why did they live here? They look around at the beautiful walls that still have their plasters on them, and they think, this is a really comfortable space.
And then to get out of Balcony House, there's this tunnel that you crawl through, and the tunnel is about 15 feet long, and people have to get down on all fours and crawl through it. And you get into the middle of the tunnel, and you can actually stand up. I wonder how many people, when they stand up, look above them, because there's an original wooden roof above. And then when we get out,
So you can tell that this is actually an original wooden roof from 800 years ago, where all the places where they have like rooms and stuff, this is what would have probably been above them. Just because of weathering and time, they have just went away. But they had made like wooden roofs to be able to walk across different levels and stuff like that.
the tunnel, we climb up another couple of ladders and go up some steps that we carved into the side of the cliff. It always makes me wonder what it was like to raise kids in the cliff dwellings, and if kids just grew up scaling cliff sides, or if the parents in the cliff dwellings were also nervous about their kids and didn't let them start climbing up the cliff side until a certain age.
Again, just provides great insight to what the home would have been like 800 years ago.
So now we're going to watch a quick video about we're going to watch one more. This is actually called Longhouse. It's also a pretty big dwelling that will tell you a little bit more about where people that lived in the cliff dwellings actually got water. So there's actually evidence of smaller versions of this even in Cliff Palace and Balcony House, where you can actually see crevices with little pools underneath them. So on here, be paying a specific attention to what they call seep streams.
If you're looking for a more adventurous tour, I would definitely go with Longhouse. It's actually as big as Cliff Palace. It's 150 rooms and 21 kivas.
Longhouse is the most in-depth tour. It's a hiking tour as well. So we're going to hike 2.25 miles round trip. You're going to descend down into a canyon about 150 feet. So there's some elevation change. You'll get to actually tour through Longhouse, climb some ladders, see the main water source for the Ancestral Puebloan people, which is a seep spring.
It's a little bit more of a challenge to get there because you do have to walk a mile in order to get into the site. And you walk that mile with a ranger. You get to go beyond just the basics. You get to talk a little bit more about what life was like even before the cliff dwellings.
Some of the highlights of Longhouse tour would, number one, be the size of the site. Another thing that's really great about this site is you can really see how agriculture affected these people here, how it allowed them to live together in such large numbers. The views coming in and out of Longhouse, just the trail getting in and out, is just amazing. You get great views down canyon, and also you can see a lot of where the fires came through.
And we continue with the group down into the site. We climb up the ladders and we gather around the seep spring. The seep spring is very central to the story of the cliff dwellings. We now believe that it's those seep springs that bring people down from the mesa tops into the cliffs to be closer to those water sources.
It's one of these incredible points of ingenuity where you can see the carved little basins in the spring where water would collect. And even from there, Ancestral Pueblo folks carved little channels in the bedrock to direct the flow of water into what we call cupules, these little depressions just big enough for a gourd or a clay dipper where you could fill your water jug.
And we continue on through the site.
So what that was just now about is in the cliffs, there are crevices that go from the top of the mesa to down deep inside the cliffs into the mountains, where you can actually find little like river streams, or they're called seep streams, that have where water has seeped through the ground, and it pools where, of course, where the rock ends. And so the ancestral Puebloan people found where these go to, and they have tried to reroute the water to make it more accessible, and they've also made it so they can actually get the water out using the tools that they had created.
We go down a ladder and down a series of steps, and at the very end we gather in a large plaza.
We see probably by the dance plaza that's there that this would have been a community that did accept some of the migration that was coming up from the southern areas. In some cases, people say this is it possible to be a great kiva. If it is, there's a lot of change going on at once, and that would have come with those migrants. It's above ground rather than underground. It's square, it's not round, and it may have been open air rather than roofed, and it's community oriented.
So what she was just now talking about is that there is evidence that just because people lived at the cliff dwellings for such a long period of time, from like 600 all the way to 1300, there's evidence that they have like changed how they started building. And so in the longhouse, the building or the architecture itself looks a little bit different than even in the cliff palace. And so possibly people have like migrated from a different culture or from a different location and like brought their ideas with them, or they have just changed over time just for efficiency or ease of building. We'll never be really sure, but there is just evidence of changes in their architecture throughout the time period that they actually lived there.
With my group, I love to construct an image of what life would have looked like 800 years ago, when the walls were twice as high, when they were all plastered on the inside and out, when they all had their flat roofs, and hundreds of people from across the canyons have come to gather to watch the celebration that was taking place inside of that courtyard. It would have been magical. There would have been a fire going in the middle. It would have been reflecting off of all the walls and the people's faces who have gathered to watch the event. And the sound would have gone down canyon for miles. And you can imagine that sound probably makes its way all the way down to Cliff Palace. It provides a better sense, again, of what life was like here. A lot of people, they simply look at this architecture and they say it's strictly defensive, but I think there's more to the story. Because when you're standing inside those courtyards and there's a large event happening and the sound is issuing down canyon, they're not hiding.
So what he's talking about when he's saying they're not hiding is people think that this was a defensive move to build your dwellings down deep into a cliff, because for anyone to actually access your house, they had to go to extreme lengths to actually climb down a cliff to actually get to you. But this is actually saying that there's evidence that not only were these defensive, but it was also just the way of their life, and that there might have been other reasoning besides just being on the lookout for your family as a protective measure, but to be able to communicate even through the cliffs, and who knows, maybe just to even see the beautiful scenery or the views from where they live.
It actually seems like a very visible space.
So that's a little bit more about Mesa Verde. So Mesa Verde is, right now it's actually closed, but you, for the most part, after the quarantine, you should be able to go back and visit there. It's about at least a one-day trip, because it takes quite a while to actually go through the entire park to actually even just get to any of the tours that you can take. But it is really amazing. So if you ever get a chance to go there, I highly recommend it. It's amazing to see that people built their entire village deep down inside of a cliff, as to where we just build straight on top of the ground. They took building to a whole nother level, and not only to a whole nother level of architecture, but something that was so well done that it has lasted for over 800 years. So it's pretty amazing. So today on your timeline, you are going to be drawing one of your locations is Mesa Verde. So on your Mesa Verde part, you're going to draw a cliff dwelling. There's a couple of different instances that we've done for the last couple of years. So you're going to draw a cliff dwelling, then you're going to open it up, and you're going to tell us something about Mesa Verde that you've learned. And then in the date on the timeline, you are going to put 600-1300, because that is the time period that the ancestral Puebloan people actually lived in Mesa Verde. So your Indian timeline will look something like this, where you should be able to flap it up and it should be able to see the date that that happened and so forth. So Mesa Verde is a required location because that is one of the oldest locations that you can actually find evidence of people living in Colorado. And if you ever get a chance to go there, like I said, I highly recommend it. It's totally cool. I've been there a couple years ago. It's pretty cool. Anyways, have fun drawing your picture of Mesa Verde and hope you learned a lot. If you would like to do more research, there's plenty of research out there. Just look up Mesa Verde National Park and you'll find tons. Have fun and have a great day.